Hi everyone, I'm Peter, Editor-in-Chief of Fair Forward, and I'm here with Jordan Monge, one of our bloggers and regular contributors, and we're going to talk a little bit about her conversion and experience as a Christian. So I just want to start off telling a little bit about your background and who you are and where you come from.
So, my name is Jordan, and I grew up in a household that wasn't Christian, and I actually converted to Christianity during my freshman year at Harvard, and now I work for the Veritas Forum, which is an organization that hosts large university events on life's hardest questions, like why are we here? What is our purpose? Do science and faith go together, or are they in conflict? And we try to make Jesus Christ relevant to all areas of life.
So tell us a little bit about your faith in high school and where you were with religion then, and then how you became a Christian at Harvard and what that involved.
Yeah, so my story kind of goes back to a very, very young age. So the first kind of story my parents tell me about when I was little is when I was 4, my mom was at a party once and she walked into the room to check on me. And all she caught was me telling this other little 6-year-old girl, "But how do you know what the Bible says is true?" So as you can imagine, if this was me at 4, I just got a little bit more aggressive over time.
Yeah.
I mellowed out a little bit in high school, but I was still pretty intense. When I went back to really look at my Bible the first time, it still had all the Post-it notes from where I had brought it into school to point out contradictions to my friends. And so it wasn't until I actually got to Harvard where I met Christians who could answer some of the questions that I had. So in the past, in high school, I had said, well, what about this contradiction in the Bible? Or what about this argument about kind of the Euthyphro dilemma?
Sure.
Or what about these other logical problems for God?
Yeah.
And nobody really gave me a good answer. They oftentimes just told me, well, it's something you just have to take on faith. And it wasn't until I came to Harvard that I realized there are Christians who do have answers to these questions. I thought that I had thought about it a lot, and really what I had done was just talk to other people who were as dumb and inexperienced as me.
Right.
And of course, they didn't have any better answers than I did.
Right.
And it wasn't until I really started investigating that I discovered these arguments that I thought were really good against God were actually quite weak, and that people had rebuttals to them for
centuries,
decades, if
decades,
not thousands of years. So basically, I got into a series of arguments with one of my friends who worked for the Harvard Ichthus.
And you want to explain the Harvard Ichthus?
Yeah, so the Ichthus is a journal of Christian thought and expression at Harvard. One of my friends was writing for it, and he wrote this kind of apologetic in it, and we kept discussing back and forth and arguing basically about, can you be good without God?
Yeah.
Does ethics function if there's no real grounding for it?
Right. Intellectual grounding, right?
Yeah, metaphysical grounding.
Yeah.
And so that was part of the argument, and then we started arguing about, well, what are good arguments for God's existence, and what are good arguments for the Bible being true, or for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so basically we argued back and forth for about 6 months, and he kept winning the arguments. It was like, okay, maybe you're right.
Maybe there's something there.
Right, maybe you're right that if I'm an atheist, I should be a nihilist. Maybe, but that doesn't mean that God exists. That just means that I should become a nihilist, right? And then I was like, well, maybe you're right that God exists, but he must be this type of deistic, distant God. I was like, well, maybe you're right that God is active in the world, but I'm still not sure if I believe this whole Bible Jesus thing. And basically, over the 6 months, he just won every argument. And so at the end, I both rationally believed the scriptures, and I also just felt that it was true. I saw the beauty in it. I saw the kind of change that it was affecting in my life. And I realized that I really believed it, heart and soul, and head. And so it was at that point that I decided to get baptized and officially become a Christian.
That's great. So it wasn't just for you. I mean, obviously the arguments were a large part of what it was, but there was more of this. You also had this experience of personal conversion and emotional resonance with the gospel too, right? So that was part of the process.
Yeah, I think for me, I had never really heard the gospel presented at once before, and I had never really thought about what Christians believed about Easter, really. Even though I lived in a Christian country, surrounded by Christian friends. I had never really given it much thought. And it was only my freshman year in college where I realized the message of Christianity is basically we're all screwed up, which seemed true.
Yeah.
And
pretty obviously true.
Right.
Chesterton said it's the only doctrine that can be proved. I mean, it's just so obvious.
Exactly. Yeah. And I saw that in myself, that I was messed up and guilty, and that God still loved us anyway, and that he demonstrated that love in sacrificing his son as a ransom for us. And so I had never really thought about Christianity as beautiful before. I just thought of it as kind of weird. Yeah. But all of a sudden I realized, no, people believe this because there's something beautiful about this idea of love as sacrifice. And the more that I thought about it, the more it just struck me as obviously true, even though, I had spent 18 years denying that was the case. For me, when I really started investigating Christianity, when I stopped saying, I'm just going to look up the arguments that prove my side and then see if any of my friends can respond, when I said, I'm actually going to seek out the best answers, I'm going to look at the huge Western intellectual Christian tradition and see what Aquinas has said, what Lewis has said. Exactly. And when I did that, it became very clear to me that Christianity and reason are not antithetical, that in fact Christianity is defined by reason. The first book that I read in the Bible was the book of John, and it begins with, in the beginning was the Word. Why did you choose that? Sorry. I was told to read John first. Okay. I don't know if they did it because they knew I was a philosopher, or if they just personally liked the book of John. Yeah. But the most philosophical, for sure. Yeah, those are books. It was a good choice. Yeah. So it begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right. And then in verse 14 it says, and the Word became flesh. And the really terrible thing is that, though I think most of the Bible is incredibly well translated, you can always lose something in translation. So the word that's translated as word in John is actually logos, which means reason, wisdom, logic. And so when you read John 1, you realize what it's really saying is that Jesus Christ is wisdom embodied, reason embodied. And so Christianity can't... Truth as a person, right? Exactly, truth as a person. Yeah. And so Christianity is, by definition, rational. Right. And so it became that I found incredibly appealing. And I think the tricky thing is that our reason is often flawed because of our fallen nature, because we're limited by our own imagination, by the time and era and geographical location in which we grow up. We have to be careful about trusting our reason fully, but we should expect that there is an answer to all the questions that we have, that there is a reasonable basis for the faith, because Christ is reason. Yeah. And so that I found incredibly appealing, and I wish that Christians talked about that more. So yeah, I think you raised a good point about going to the experts, right? Because if you want to learn about biology or evolution or something like that, you consult the best textbooks or the best writers. Right. Whereas it seems with Christianity or with religion in general, people tend to just take whatever they hear from their friends or from people who are not experts on these questions as the authoritative answers, and they reject those because they don't sound very good. So, I mean, it seems in your life, part of the journey was moving from going to your friends who maybe weren't that well informed to actually looking into what some of the theologians had and philosophers had said in the Christian tradition. Yeah, that's very true. And so I think part of it had to do with finally meeting a friend who could answer some of these questions. Also, a lot of the people who claim to be experts, who should be experts, a lot of pastors are pastors because they're good at dealing with people's personal problems, not because they've thought necessarily philosophically deeply about all these issues, or that they have the answer to every question that a person might ask. And so, in my experience, even going to pastors is not always the best route. It was really looking into the intellectual tradition and examining some of these questions beyond just like a cursory glance. Right. And when I did that, I quickly found things like the Euthyphro dilemma have been debated back and forth for centuries. Addressed endlessly, and that, in fact, it seems like the better answers are on the Christian side. So you've talked a lot about the role of reason and intellect in your conversion, but you recently wrote a post for the Harvard Ichthus called Depression and Despair at Harvard, which got how many hits was it? 4,000 unique hits, so that means 4,000 people read it. Incredibly popular post that was linked to on national blogs and everything.
And that took a slightly different approach, right? You learned a lesson from that about the intellect that was slightly different than what you've been emphasizing here.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically I spent the first 3 years of my life as a Christian trying to replicate my experience, trying to argue with people, present the evidence, write apologetics on why I thought Christianity was true. And none of it proved to be very fruitful. Didn't get that many people to read it.
Right.
And I think that's because I'm really weird. And there aren't a lot of people like me. And one of the things that you realize when you become a Christian is that you try to be all things to all people. You try to meet other people where they're at. And so, I mean, I described the story in the blog post fairly well, but the short version, I suppose, is that there was a recent suicide at Harvard, and it was the second suicide in 6 months. And I realized that I had spent a lot of my college career struggling at various points with suicide. I think for slightly different reasons, in fact. At first, I considered it when I was confronted with this question of God and thinking, I don't believe in God. Maybe there is no point to the universe. Maybe I should just be a nihilist. And if I'm a nihilist, why not? There's no bad. There's no real value. So, and the second time, it was also kind of when I had doubts about God, starting to think maybe this atheism nihilism thing is true again. And the third time, it was when I was going through a lot of struggles with the church that I was in, and not fully seeing the Christian life and Christian walk for the beauty and power that it has. And so each time it got a little bit easier, I think, as my faith grew. But my senior year, struggled a lot with depression because I think I took too much on my plate, which is a very common experience for Harvard students. And
no kidding.
and I felt a great deal of guilt for not being good enough, and I found that guilt incapacitating in terms of being able to get my work completed. And basically I ended up almost failing one of my classes. And the interesting thing to me was, though I was sort of diagnosed with depression, I didn't really feel depressed most of the time. In fact, I had a great deal of joy. And as I was going through that experience, in which case this was the first time where I had been actually struggling with a lack of self-confidence as opposed to like philosophical problems. The first time when it felt like my life was kind of crumbling before me, and not just my reason crumbling.
Yeah.
I found that I was more at peace with the situation. And it was because of my faith, because I trusted that God was going to work through this experience and that he would use this to teach me some sort of important lesson, likely humility, that I was able to cope with that experience and to find peace through it, even though it was, incredibly terrifying to be going through.
Right.
And I kind of I had enough insight to see that God would probably use it in the future, but I didn't really expect him to use it in about 3 months. It was incredibly painful. I didn't tell my parents until I wrote the post, and I couldn't...
So what happened was you wrote, after the suicide happened, you wrote a post about
exactly.
your own...
I wrote about...
detailing your own experiences with depression.
Right. So I wrote about it, and basically with the purpose of sharing my story with others, because a lot of schools that are highly competitive, you feel like you can't be open about your failings, and so competitive, you feel like, if I tell you what I'm really going through, it's just going to confirm, it's just going to confirm what I always suspected, which was true, which is that you are in fact, smarter and more talented and handsomer or more beautiful than I possibly could be, and so I'm, you bottle it all up inside, and I realized that's both incredibly unhealthy and spiritually disastrous. And so I found that I just felt like I needed to confess what I had gone through and to share it with my friends in the hopes that it would give them some hope when they were going through similar experiences, that somebody else had gone through it and made it through. And so I wrote about it, and 4,000 people read it, and I got dozens and dozens of emails, and had a few sleepless nights. But it was a really, really cool experience, and I got to see kind of immediately how God used my pain and my suffering to help others
And so it was through sharing this personal experience that you were able to reach people that you hadn't been able to reach through the straightforward philosophical, apologetical angle.
Exactly. Right? And I hadn't really expected that. You know, I had spent so long trying to show people that Christianity was true, and what I think I really needed to do was to open up about my own life and to share my experience of faith. And yeah, all of my friends read it when they, you know, didn't read all the articles I wrote about.
Yeah.
Why the historicity of the
morality,
resurrection. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So kind of with that in mind, I guess one final question for you is, I mean, to put it kind of blithely, but as someone who has been evangelized successfully, and as Christians, obviously Christians are very concerned with the proper techniques or the proper mechanisms of evangelization, what would you say to the Christian church at large about, from your experience, about how they should approach speaking Christianity into the culture?
To be a community that's open to people who are exploring and open to people who are having doubts and having questions, I think is incredibly important. And even the first 2 years of being a Christian, I still grappled with doubts a lot.
Sure.
And the reaction that I got to it was very negative, as though I wasn't being a good enough Christian because I still wasn't 100% sure.
Right.
And I think the definition...
The idea of asking questions is kind of treasonous or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think what's most helpful is to be a place where it's okay to doubt and to wrestle with God, because that's really what it took. It took 2 solid years of me wrestling with God and working through questions, and what quickly proved to be the case was I had started out with some basic questions, and I learned a response, and then I found out better, deeper questions, and then I learned a response, and then I had better, harder questions.
Going deeper and deeper,
down the rabbit hole, and it took a lot of personal wrestling. And so I think encouraging people to wrestle with God is incredibly important. And a lot of times people just try to gloss over it with faith. And what I found instead was that by wrestling, I developed a deeper faith. So I think it's important to simultaneously be not afraid of wrestling and of people who wrestle with God, but also to encourage it.